Hashem, today's daf yomi is Menachos Nun Gimel, Menachos Nun Dal, and Menachos 54, but we're going to start on the last line on 53b. We have said that two of the korbanos have to have chametz. It's the korban toda has to come from chametz, and the korban and the shtei lechem, the two loaves of bread on Shavuos, have to come from chametz. So on the bottom line of 53b, the Gemara says, how do you make them chametz? So the Gemara cites a brayta, ein machmitzin, that it's not sufficient leavening, meaning it's not chametz if it's using tapuchim, if it's using this tapuach. Tapuach in modern Hebrew is an apple, but in Talmud it was probably some sort of citrus fruit. So that is not sufficient. If you use the tapuach juice to ferment it, that wouldn't be sufficient. Mishum Rebbe Chanina ben Gamliel amru machmitzin. He says, no, you can use it. Rav Kahana mas nitlei. Rabbi Chanina ben Tardian, Kiman azla hadatana. Like who is the following Mishnah from Trumos, which states tapuach sharisco. Let's say you have a crushed apple, benasnu betocha isa, and you put it into the dough, v'chimtza, so the apple juice made the dough ferment. Harezu asura. It's prohibited, meaning to say, what does it mean when it say asura? It means it can only be eaten by a kohen. So who is that like? So, come on, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. Maybe it's like the position of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, who says that the juice of the apple can cause it to ferment. So the Gemara says maybe it's like Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel and not the Rabbanan. I feel Tema Rabbanan. It could even say it's like the Rabbanan who say that a machmitzim betapuchim. But what they mean to say is I feel Tema Rabbanan mihidu chametz gamerlo. But it's not going to be complete chametz to make it the chametz that you need for a korban, but nuksha miyahavi. But it is a partial chametz, and so therefore, even the Rabbanan would say the truma can't be eaten by a kohen. So this relates to the question of egg matzah on Pesach, because, or what we call matzah ashira, because it seems to be from the Maskana of our Gemara. The conclusion here, it seems to be saying that meiperos causes chametz. So if that's the case, how do we explain this with the Gemara in Pesachim that says meiperos emachmitz, and that meiperos does not cause chametz? So the Tosfos draws the conclusion that there's a distinction about whether water is involved. That if there's water, then in our case here, it's talking about whether there's water in addition to the fruit juice, and that's where it causes the chametz. But if it is no water, that's the Gemara in Pesachim. If there's no water, then we're going to say that it doesn't cause chametz. So. So that's why Tosfos Dibra Maskil Ain. He says Dibra Maskil Ain Machmitzin. It's a very big dames, very big Tosfos, and brings the several sugyas and shas that says the meiperos does cause chametz, and so therefore Tosfos says Rabbeinu Tam draws this distinction that our sugya is talking about where it is with water together it causes chametz. And in fact, it causes quicker chametz. But meiperos by itself, without water, it doesn't cause chametz. And the Rambam also has this distinction. Okay. Anyway, Maskana, the Sephardim say that if it's just juice, then you can use it with flour. But the Ashkenazim are the position that we should be strict on Pesach unless you're very young or very poor health. Not to use meiperos. So now the Gemara continues. Amar Rabbi Eli, ein lecha hakasha l'kmitza yoser miminchas chotes. So Rabbi Eli records a statement. He says there's nothing that is harder to do a kmitza on than the mincha of a sinner. Rashi explains the mincha of a sinner is very dry, and so therefore it's hard to do the kmitza because you don't want, if it's just flour, you don't want the kmitza, there's no oil in the mincha v'chotes, so you don't want the flour to be missing. When you scoop it up, it has to be exact, and so it's very hard without the liquid. So Rabbi Yitzchak Baradimi Amar, no, that's not the case. Minchas chota megabo b'mayim. You could take the flour, add a little bit of water, ukshera, and then you can have a nice mixture, and you can do a proper kamitza. So Gemara says, without it protruding from the fingers or being too much or too little. So the Gemara says, maybe this is the argument. Gemara savar kamos shehein misharinan. Gemara savar kamos shahayu misharinan. So maybe this is the dispute that one says we look at the amount that it is now, and right now it is the proper amount. And so therefore you can, after you add a little bit of water, it's not considered like it's deficient or too much, because we look at it after the water is added and it is the proper amount. And before the water, we look at what it was before the water was added, and therefore we don't have the amount for a kamitza because the water adds to it. Where it says no, the cooling alma kamos shehein misharinan. Everybody says we look at it what it is now. This is the dispute. The Marasavar my chareva. Well, one is in the position. What does it mean dry? Chareva mishemen, dry from oil, but you could add the water, and so therefore it's not a problem. The Marasavar chareva mikol davar. But Rabbi Eli says when it says dry, it means you can't have any water either, and so therefore it's completely dry, and there's not only no shemen, there's also no mayim. Gemara says, so now since we're discussing, do we look at something the way it is now or the way it was? The Gemara cites the Mishnah in Uktzin, the last tractate, says with respect to the tumah, that food can transmit tumah if it's the size of an egg. So the Gemara says, Tanan Hasan Basar Ego, let's say you have the meat of a calf, Shenispach, that after you cooked it, it got bigger, it swelled. Ubasar Zakena, and now it's bigger than the size of an egg. Ubasar Zakena, and the meat of an older animal, Shenismayach, after you cooked it, it shrunk. Mishtarina l'kamoshain. If we want to know if it transmits tumah, we look at what it is now, the size. If it has to be the size of an egg now. Rav Rabbi Chiyav Rabbi Yochanan Amri, Mishtarina kamoshain, and Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Bar Rabbi Reish Lakish Amrin Moose. So we have to change the text. So the Rab, so we have to look at the text. Rabbi Yochanan Amri, that the Mishnah is saying that we look at it what it is now after it swelled up, and so therefore the calf will be able to transmit tumah, whereas the older one does not. Whereas Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Bar Reish Lakish Amri Mishtarinan lekamos shehin, meaning to say we look at it. He changes the kamos shahayu. The Bach changes it. We look at it what it was from the beginning, and so therefore, what this Mishnah means is that the calf is tahor because it wasn't the amount, and the meat of the elder animal is tamei because it was the amount before it shrunk. So the Gemara challenges the position of Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Reish Lakish to say we look at it kamos shahayu from a brisa. Meisvei, what does the brisa say? Basar ego shaloya bal kashir. Let's say the meat of a calf didn't have the size of an egg. V'tafach v'amar al kashir, and now it's the size of a calf. Tahor l'shavar, whatever was in the past is tahor. V'tamei mikanu labah, and from this point on it's tamei. So clearly we look at it what it is now. So it's a question on the three Amoraim who said we look at what it was. So the Gemara says midrabanan. No, the Shmuel and his cohort there, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe would say, no, that refers to rabbinically. We say it from now on it's tamei, but not biblically. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, ema sefer. The next clause of the price says, also with respect to pigel and noser. Now, if you want to say it's a biblical law, Hainu the ika pigol v'noser. There's biblical law if you eat pigol or noser. Eliyamris d'Rabbanan. If you say it's rabbinic, pigol v'noser d'Rabbanan mika. The pigol and noser are not by. It's not a rabbinic law. It's a biblical law. We don't give you kares for eating pigol rabbinically. So the Gemara says, no, what the scenario is, Ema v'chein b'tumas pigel. The rabbis made a decree that if you touched meat that was pigel, then you become tamei. So that's what it means. Also, by the tumah of pigel, we look at what it is now. V'chein b'tumas noser. And also by tumas noser, we look at what it is now. So you might have thought all the tumas pigel, but tumas noser drabanani. You might have thought because pigel and noser are rabbinically tamei. That the rabbis wouldn't make a decree, A, on what it is after it gets swollen, and B, also on the rabbinic tumah of pigul and oser. So we might have said, Kamash, no, what they do, they would say, we also look at with respect to pigul and oser, it applies there as well. Tashma, so Gemara again tries to bring a proof. Again, Shmuel, Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, and Rish Lakish, who say we look at what it was, and this comes from another brayso, Tashma, Basar Zikna, the meat of an older animal, Shayabo Kashir. It had the amount, Bitzamak, it shriveled up, Pachos Mikashir, and it's no longer the size of an egg. Tamei, L'Sha'avar. Then whatever it touched in the past before it shriveled is Tamei. Vitar Mikano Abba, and from this point on is Tamei, is Tahor. Amarabba, so Rabba explains, so we see from here explicitly that whatever is for the future, we look at it what it is now. And so this is direct refutation. Hold on 1 second. So the Gemara explains, in this case, Gemara explains, Rabba, wherever originally had the tumah, but now it's shriveled, so it doesn't have it. It doesn't have the amount. In every case where it originally had, but now it no longer has it, midrabanan, we'll say everybody will agree that rabbinically it's tamei. Ki pliki, we're on the top of Nandal Amabeis. Where are they arguing? Only in a circumstance, kikon shahayubo kashir, it had the amount, vitzamak, and after it had the amount, it shriveled up. V'chazar v'tafach, and then after it has the amount and shriveled up, it once again swelled. Demar savar yesh dichoy be'isura, that the position of Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, they're of the position that once it was pushed off, the Isura was pushed off, it can no longer become prohibited again. Mar Savar, whereas the Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yochanan, they're in the position, ain't dichoy be'isura. And so therefore, that we don't say dichoy by a prohibition, and so therefore it can become tamei again, become prohibited again. And Gemara says, is there really such a position that says this concept of yesh dichoy be'isurin? And now we cite the Mishnah in Taharos, v'atanan, kabetza, let's ocholin, let's say you have the size of an egg of food that's tamei, she'nicham b'chama v'nismatu, you put them in the sun, and they shriveled. All of these amounts that you put them in the sun, they shriveled. Tahorin, we're going to say they're tahor. So you put them in and they shriveled up, you're tahor. Let's say then you then put them in the rain and they got filled up again. So we see from here explicitly, we don't say dichoy by Yisurin. Gemara says tiyufta. The Gemara says, you're right, this is a refutation. It's a refutation against those positions who say that by Yisurin we say it was overridden. So it is a refutation against those three Amoraim. So now the Gemara brings a brisa to prove the case about what we are calculating. So, yeah, we calculate according to what it was from the beginning. So before we get to that, we have to do a background. That we know that after you harvest the crops, you have to give truma and meiser. Truma Gedola is given to the Kohen. And this Truma, there's no explicit amount, even one kernel, although rabbinically we say it's either 1/40th if you're doing it generously, or 1/50th if you're Benoni, or 1/60th if you're doing it stingily. And after you give the Truma to the Kohen, the owner gives 1/10 of the crop to the Levites, and that's called Ma'aser Rishon, and that's biblically. And the Levi gives whatever he gave, another truma, that's a tenth to the Kohen, 10%, and that's called trumas meiser, and that's also biblical. So now we're going to get into this. So we learn in the Mishnah in Trumos, tormin te'enim al ha-grogoros. You're allowed to, so the grogoros are the dried figs, and the te'enim are the ripe figs. So you're allowed to take a tormin here means meiser. You're allowed to take meiser, meaning 1/10 of the ripe figs, and separate them as a meiser for the dried figs, b'minyan, but only if you do it by the number, because the moist figs will eventually become dry. So it's the same amount. So you could say if you have 90 dry figs and 10 ripe figs, you take 10 of the ripe figs and say that that's meiser and give it to the Levi. Now, if you want to say we look at it what it is now, shapir, well then that makes sense. Meaning to say, if you look at it what it was, and we look at the figs as though they were once ripe figs, that makes sense. Shapir. But if we look at it what is now, then we have a problem because they're not the same. Because the volume of the ripe figs is much bigger than the dry figs. And so therefore he's giving more than what he's supposed to give. And that is a problem because you have to give exact. And it's basically, it's like he's separating a fifth, because the ripe figs are are double the size of the dry figs, and you're not allowed to give extra tithe because we learned in the Brisa, Amarba b'Meiser. What's the problem with giving too much tithe? Peirosav mitukanim. Yeah, you took Meiser umas rosav mikulkalim, but part of that Meiser is messed up because yes, because there is in there a portion of the permitted Meiser which the Kohen can eat, but there's also a portion that he added, and there it's not Meiser, and also it wasn't Matukan, so it's still Tevel. Elamai, so what should you do? Look at Moshe, we look at it at what it was. And so therefore, we look at the dry figs as though they are ripe figs. It can't be. Ema Seifa, it says in the next clause in the Brisa, Grogroros alatehinim. Now, let's say you have the dry figs and you want to separate them for the ripe figs, b'mida. Those you do by the volume. Now, if you want to say that we look at it what they are now, shapir, that makes sense. But if we say according to what they were when they were still figs, then we're giving too much meiser. Ella, we have to say we're referring to not when we say tarmin here, we're not referring to meiser, we're referring to the truma that the Kohen, that the Levi gives to the Kohen. And the Reisha, and when in the first clause it's talking about a case, ba'ayin yafeh. The Seifa, ba'ayin yafeh. Meaning to say that the fact that you have to give exact, that's by the Meiser. But by the Trumas Meiser, it doesn't have to be exact. You give generously. What about the next clause? Amar Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Yossi, That he would take he would take 10 cakes of dried figs. Al tishim shabakalkoa, 10 from the one utensil for 90 that were in a different utensil. V'ichu magadola asar maya vidite, meaning to say, why is he giving 10 when he should give more? I said we're talking about truma. No, it's not truma gadola, which would be 10%, which would be 140, 150, 160, but it's trumas meiser, which is 10%, but you could do it with an ayin yafa. So that's the Gemara's conclusion. And this is the position of Abu Lazar ben Gomel. The Tanya Abu Lazar ben Gomel Omer. Nechshe lachem trumas chem shtei trumas akasim bedaber achas trumas gedola v'achas truma ketana achas trumas gedola nitalas beomer u'machshava ela tach trumas meiser nitla beomed b'ayin yafa av trumas meiser b'ayin yafa. Just like the truma gedola could be given with an ayin yafa, so too the trumas meiser. And in that context, umina, and from that position of Rabbi Elazar himself, we could prove, because Amar Rabbi Elazar Bar Rabbi Yossi, Abba Yonoto Eser Grogro Shabbat Al Tishim, he took 10 dry figs for 90 Shabbat Kokoa. Now, if we say we look at it at what it was, Shapir, Eli Amras Kamushahin, if you look at it as what it is now, Batzalahu, it's too little. So therefore we look at it what it was. So Kiyasar Avdimi Amar Rebbe Lazar Shani Grogros. No, don't bring a proof from the figs. All v'yachol sholkan l'achzir commotion. No, because you could eventually get them back. So if the case of figs is different than in general, so we don't bring a proof about that. So okay, we'll stop here. Baruch Hashem. We'll stop here.